The wagon wheel snapped like a rifle shot through the canyon, echoing off the red cliffs as dust rose thick into the dying sun. The preacher's carriage toppled sideways, spilling trunks, books, and belongings across the rough desert trail. One terrified scream split the stillness, then silence followed. Heavy, waiting, endless. Ezra Colt heard it from half a mile up the ridge. He stopped his horse on a rise, gray eyes narrowing toward the sound. A man of near 7 feet, weathered by 20 years of wind, war, and wilderness, Ezra looked carved from the land itself, a monument of muscle and stone. But when he heard that scream again, thinner, desperate, something inside him stirred. He kicked his horse hard, and the animal bolted down the rocky slope. The canyon closed around him like a throat, every sound sharp and alive. As Ezra rounded the bend, the wreck came into view. The carriage lay on its side, one wheel still spinning lazily. White linen and lace spilled like snow across the red earth, and among them a body pinned beneath the frame. The man's black coat marked him clearly. A preacher. Ezra leapt from the saddle before his horse stopped. His boots hit the ground with a thud, and then he heard another sound. A whimper, soft and frightened, from inside the broken carriage. He dropped to one knee, his rough hands pushing aside splintered wood. There, caught between the wreckage and the canyon wall, was a girl. Her white dress was torn, her dark hair tangled with dust and blood. She couldn't have been more than 20. Ezra braced his shoulder against the carriage and pushed. Wood groaned, his muscles strained, and sweat rolled down his temple. Inch by inch, the heavy frame lifted just enough for her to crawl free. When she pulled herself clear, he let it drop with a crash that echoed through the canyon. For a long moment, she just knelt in the dirt, staring at him with eyes wide as the sky. Blue with a hint of violet in the fading light. Then fear replaced gratitude. She shrank back, trembling. Ezra understood. To her, he was no savior, just a giant stranger rising from the dust, scarred and grim as judgment. He raised both hands, palms open. "I ain't here to hurt you," he said, his voice rough and deep, "but you need to move. That man under there, is he breathing?" Her lips trembled. She looked toward the crushed preacher and nodded weakly. "My father," she whispered, Preacher Samuel Whitmore, "please, please help him." Ezra knelt beside the fallen man. One look told him the truth. The preacher's chest rose shallow, blood darkening his vest. He had minutes left, no more. Ezra pressed a steadying hand to the man's shoulder, but his eyes flicked toward the girl. Her hands shaking, her dress torn, her face streaked with tears. The preacher tried to speak. Blood bubbled instead of words. The girl fell to her knees beside him, sobbing, "Father, please!" Ezra caught her wrist gently before she could touch him. "Don't," he said softly. "Let him go easy." She looked up at him, eyes full of disbelief. "No! You lifted it before. You can do it again. You're strong enough." But Ezra only shook his head. "Moving it'll kill him faster. Let him rest." The girl made a broken sound and tried anyway, clawing at the carriage with trembling fingers. Ezra wrapped his arms around her, pulling her back. She struggled, beating at his chest. But he didn't let go until her fight melted into sobs. She sagged against him, small and trembling, her face buried against his shirt. By the time the sun sank behind the cliffs, the preacher was gone. The desert fell silent again, broken only by Clara Whitmore's quiet weeping. Ezra laid his coat gently over the dead man's face, the act done with reverence that came from long practice. He'd buried too many people in his time, soldiers, friends, strangers. Death was no stranger here. "What's your name?" he asked quietly. "Clara." She said through tears, "Clara Whitmore." He nodded. "Clara, I'm Ezra Colt. I'll bury your father proper. Then we'll get you somewhere safe." She looked around. At the wreckage, at the endless walls of stone. "There's nowhere," she whispered. "We were going to Redemption Springs. Father had a church waiting. We sold everything to make the journey." Her voice broke. "Now there's nothing." Ezra studied her. Dust and tears streaked her pale face, but her chin lifted despite it all. There was courage there, buried deep but real. "You'll come with me," he said at last. "I've got a cabin 2 days north. You can stay till you figure your next step." Clara's eyes widened. "I can't," she stammered. "That wouldn't be proper. I'm an unmarried woman, and you're," she faltered, looking up at his towering frame. "You're a stranger." Ezra's tone stayed steady. "Proper won't keep you alive out here. Cold's coming fast. You got 2 choices. Ride with me or stay and freeze." Reality hit her like a slap. She looked again at her father's still body, the wreckage, the empty desert stretching for miles. Her shoulders squared, voice trembling but firm. "I'll come," she said, "but only after I bury him right." They worked by lamplight. Ezra dug while Clara gathered stones, her hands raw and bleeding by the end. When the grave was ready, he lifted her father's body as gently as if it were a child. Clara knelt by the mound, whispering a prayer through her tears. When she rose, she swayed from exhaustion. Ezra secured what little remained of her belongings, a Bible, 2 dresses, and a small wooden box she wouldn't let out of her sight. "Can you ride?" he asked. Clara nodded, though uncertainty flickered in her eyes. "Not with someone your size," she said softly. Ezra almost smiled. "Horse can handle us both." "Hold on tight." He mounted first and offered his hand. She hesitated only a moment before placing her small palm in his. His grip was warm, steady. He pulled her up behind him in one smooth motion, her dress brushing against his coat. "Hold fast," he said, and the horse surged forward. The canyon wind bit cold as they rode through the darkness. Clara clung to Ezra, her hands gripping the fabric of his shirt. Beneath her palms she could feel his strength, the solid, immovable steadiness of him. Every jolt of the horse pressed her closer, but he said nothing, only kept them moving through the long night. By dawn, the desert gave way to open grasslands painted gold by the rising sun. Clara's eyes fluttered open. The world looked strange and new, vast and wild. She realized with a start that she felt safe for the first time since the accident. Ezra guided the horse to a small creek. When he helped her down, his hand lingered just long enough to steady her drink. He said, "We've still got a ways to go." Clara knelt by the water, her reflection rippling in the current. A girl who had lost everything and somehow lived. When she looked up, Ezra was watching her, silent and unreadable. Something passed between them then. Not words, not yet, just understanding. 2 lost souls in a land that didn't forgive weakness, and neither knew that before the next sunset, their fates would be tied forever. The wind whistled through the pines as night fell over the mountains. Ezra Colt's cabin stood in a small clearing, smoke curling from the chimney, a lonely promise of warmth in the cold wilderness. Clara Whitmore swayed in the saddle, half asleep from exhaustion. When the horse stopped, she blinked awake and gasped softly. The cabin was simple but strong, built by hands that knew survival. Ezra swung down and reached up for her. Clara hesitated just long enough to remember her father's warnings about being alone with strange men. Then she took his hand. He lifted her down as if she weighed nothing. His touch was rough, but careful, the kind of strength that knew its own power. For a moment, her body leaned against his, her head near his chest, and she could hear his steady heartbeat. It felt safe. Too safe. She stepped back quickly, her cheeks burning. Ezra pretended not to notice. "Come on," he said. "You'll catch cold out here." Inside, the cabin was small but neat. 1 room, a stone fireplace, a wooden table, and a single bed in the corner. Clara's eyes caught on that bed, her throat tightening. Ezra saw the flicker of worry cross her face. "You take the bed," he said, simply. "I'll sleep by the fire." She started to protest. "That's not right. It's your home," he shrugged. "You need rest more than I do." Clara stood there for a long moment, uncertain what to do with such kindness. Finally she nodded. "Thank you," she whispered. Ezra busied himself lighting the fire. "There's stew on the shelf. I'll heat it up." As he worked, Clara studied him. He moved with quiet confidence, like a man who'd spent most of his life relying on no one but himself. The firelight threw shadows across his broad shoulders and the old scars that crossed his forearms. She wondered what kind of life left marks like that, and what kind of man could survive it. When the stew was ready, they ate in silence. The only sounds were the crackle of fire and the sigh of wind outside. Clara ate slowly, her hands trembling just enough for him to notice. "You'll be safe here," Ezra said after a while, his voice low but certain. "No one comes this far unless they're lost." Clara looked up, her blue eyes reflecting the firelight. "And you? Are you lost, Mr. Colt?" He smiled faintly, the first she'd seen, maybe once. "Not anymore?" She nodded. "Then maybe I'll learn from you." Later, when she lay in his bed wrapped in a rough wool blanket, Clara couldn't sleep. The fire cast soft light across the room. Ezra sat by the hearth, cleaning his rifle. His movements were steady, his expression unreadable. For the first time in days, she wasn't afraid. Not of him, not of the wilderness, not even of what came next. She watched him for a long while, her thoughts tangled between gratitude and curiosity. There was something about him, something that drew her, even though every rule she'd ever been taught warned her to keep her distance. Finally, she closed her eyes, whispering a prayer she wasn't sure anyone still heard. "Thank you," she murmured, not to heaven, but to the man who had carried her from ruin to safety. When morning came, the world was wrapped in mist. Clara woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of an axe splitting wood outside. She found a cup waiting by the fire and stepped out into the cool air. Ezra was already working, each swing of the axe precise, powerful. He looked up when he saw her sleep, and he asked a little. She said softly, "It feels strange, being alive when everything's gone." Ezra rested the axe and leaned on the handle. "You keep moving," he said. "That's how you stay alive. You keep putting one foot in front of the other until the world starts to make sense again." Quote. His words settled in her heart like warmth. She realized he wasn't just talking about her. They spent the day fixing the fence and tending to the small garden out back. Clara insisted on helping, though her hands blistered quickly. Ezra showed her how to dig properly, how to tie a splint for the broken post. His patience surprised her. He wasn't a man of many words, but when he spoke, his voice carried calm certainty, and that made her brave. As the sun dipped behind the trees, they rested on the porch. The forest hummed with life. Cicadas, wind, distant thunder. Clara hugged her knees, watching the sky change color. "Do you ever miss people?" she asked quietly. Ezra's gaze stayed on the horizon. "Sometimes. But people don't last out here. Land's too hard, life's too short." She turned toward him. "Then why stay?" He met her eyes, and for a heartbeat, she thought she saw the truth. The loneliness behind the strength, because this land don't lie. He said, "It gives back only what you put in." "I can live with that." Clara smiled faintly. "My father used to say the same thing about faith." Quote. Ezra looked at her then, really looked, at the dirt smudged on her cheeks, the tired light in her eyes, and the strength she didn't know she had. "Your father raised a brave one," he said. Her throat tightened. "He raised me to be obedient." "I don't think that's the same as brave." "Obedience won't keep you alive out here," Ezra said, "but courage might." The rain started not long after. A hard, sudden mountain storm that drove them both inside. The cabin felt smaller now, the air thick with the smell of rain and pine. Clara mended a torn sleeve while Ezra sat by the fire, oiling his rifle. Thunder rolled, shaking the walls. She jumped. Ezra looked up. "You afraid of storms?" "Not afraid," she said quickly, then smiled faintly. "Maybe, a little." He chuckled low in his chest. "Don't worry. Roof solid. Built it myself." The sound of his laughter eased her tension. It was the first time she'd heard it. and it warmed something deep inside her. The rain lasted hours. They talked quietly, about small things, like the land, the animals, the stars. Ezra spoke of his time on the frontier, the men he'd worked with, the battles he'd survived. Clara listened, drawn to the steady rhythm of his voice. When the storm finally passed, the fire burned low. Ezra stood, stretching his massive frame. "You should sleep," he said. "And you?" she asked. "I'll keep watch," he replied. "Do you always keep watch?" "Always," he said simply. Clara hesitated, then reached out and touched his arm. "You don't have to protect me every moment." Ezra looked down at her hand, small, soft against his scarred skin. "Maybe I'm not just protecting you," he said quietly. Her breath caught. She didn't know what to say, so she withdrew her hand. "Good night, Ezra," she whispered. "Good night, Clara." She lay awake for a long time after that, listening to the fire crackle and the wind sigh through the trees. Something had changed between them that night, something neither of them could name, but both could feel. It wasn't just safety anymore, it was trust. It was the beginning of something that could either save them both or destroy them. The days passed quietly after the storm. The land softened under spring's touch, and the forest began to bloom again. Clara found a rhythm in the cabin, cooking, cleaning, tending the small garden. Ezra hunted, chopped wood, repaired the roof, and sometimes disappeared into the woods for hours, returning with fresh game or pelts to trade. At first, they spoke little. Words felt unnecessary, but as the weeks turned to months, silence gave way to conversation, gentle, steady, and full of moments that felt too heavy to name. Clara learned Ezra's habits, how he drank his coffee black and always left half a cup to cool by the window, how he rose before dawn without a sound, how he watched the sky at night like it held the answers to things he couldn't say aloud. Ezra learned her rhythms too, how she hummed softly when she cooked, how she whispered prayers she didn't truly believe, how she'd stand at the creek and stare at her reflection as if she didn't recognize the woman staring back. Something fragile was growing between them, something they both felt but didn't dare name. It was in the way Ezra's eyes lingered when Clara brushed hair from her face, and the way her heartbeat quickened every time he smiled. Rare, quiet, real. One afternoon, as the sun sank low, Ezra returned from a hunting trip with news. "I'm heading into town," he said. "We're low on salt and lamp oil." Clara's hands stilled on the table. "How long?" Quote, "3 days, maybe 4. She nodded, but the thought of being alone in the cabin made her chest tighten. Ezra noticed. "You'll be safe here," he said. "I'll make sure the rifle's loaded." Clara forced a small smile. "I'm not afraid. I just don't like the quiet." Ezra looked at her for a long moment, then touched the brim of his hat. "I'll be back soon." When he rode out at dawn, Clara watched until he disappeared into the trees. The silence that followed was deeper than she'd expected, the kind that pressed against your heart and made you listen to every creak and breath. The first night passed slowly. The second was worse. The wind howled, and shadows danced on the walls. Clara lit every lamp and read aloud from her father's old Bible, just to fill the air with sound. She fell asleep at the table, the rifle within reach. When Ezra returned on the 3rd day, she ran out to meet him before he'd even dismounted. The relief in her face stopped him cold. "You're all right," he said. "You took too long." She replied, her voice trembling more than she meant it to. Ezra dismounted and set a rough hand on her shoulder. "I told you I'd come back." Clara swallowed hard. "I know. I just didn't realize how much I'd come to believe you." Something in his expression softened. He brushed a stray lock of hair from her cheek. "You've gotten strong out here," he said. "Stronger than you know." That night, as they shared supper by the fire, the air between them felt different. No more hesitation. No more pretending they were just two strangers bound by circumstance. When their hands brushed, reaching for the same bowl, neither pulled away. Clara looked up, her blue eyes steady Ezra. She said quietly, "Do you ever think about what happens next?" He studied her face, searching for meaning next. "I can't stay here forever," she said. "And yet, I don't know how to go back to the world. Everything there feels smaller now." Ezra set down his fork. "Then, don't go back," she blinked. "What do you mean?" "I mean, you can stay," he said simply. "This land's big enough for both of us. You've made it your home, whether you meant to or not." Clara's heart pounded. People would talk. "There's no people here," he said. "Just us." She looked at him for a long moment, seeing not just the giant cowboy who'd saved her, but the man who'd given her strength when she had none. "I don't want to be a burden," she whispered. Ezra leaned forward slightly, his voice low. "You're not. You never were." The fire crackled. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, and in that small cabin, something shifted, not loud or sudden, but deep and certain. Clara reached across the table and took his hand. His fingers closed around hers, rough and warm and solid. From that night on, they lived not as strangers, but as partners. Clara worked beside him, planting new crops, mending fences, gathering herbs from the hills. Ezra taught her to shoot, to track, to survive without fear. He stopped calling her Miss Whitmore. She stopped calling him Mr. Colt. They were simply Clara and Ezra. Seasons changed, and the cabin grew fuller, with laughter, with warmth, with life. Sometimes travelers stopped by, lost or hungry. Clara would feed them, and Ezra would fix their wagons or tend their horses. Word spread quietly through the nearby settlements of the preacher's daughter who had vanished into the wilderness, and the giant cowboy who'd built her a home. Years later, when their first child was born, Clara held the baby close and whispered, "You'll never have to live by anyone else's rules. Not mine, not his. Just your own." Ezra, standing beside her, smiled faintly. "She's got your courage," he said. "And your stubbornness," Clara replied. The child's tiny fingers curled around his rough thumb, and for the first time in his life, Ezra Colt felt the weight of peace. They built a life that defied everything the world expected. Not perfect, not easy, but theirs. And in the quiet evenings when the sun slipped behind the pines, Clara would sit beside Ezra on the porch, watching the light fade from the sky. "Do you ever think about the day we met?" she'd ask. "Every time I hear thunder," he'd say, "reminds me of the wheel breaking and how close I came to riding past that canyon." "And if you had?" she'd ask softly. He'd turn to her, his gray eyes full of warmth. "Then I'd still be lost." She'd smile, resting her head against his arm. "So would I." The world around them changed. Towns grew, roads stretched farther, and the wilderness shrank, but their little cabin stayed the same. A small miracle, built from chance, courage, and love, that had nothing to do with propriety, and everything to do with choosing each other, every single day. And sometimes, when the night was clear and the fire low, Clara would whisper to the stars, "Thank you for breaking that wheel." Because in the heart of the Wild West, where survival was hard and kindness rare, a giant cowboy and a preacher's daughter had found something worth living for. A home. A family.